Segregation is on the rise in U.S. schools, this according to a new government report. While the federal government has laws and regulations in place to promote integration, the report finds schools sliding further and further away from diversity. We begin with this report from CCTV's Jim Spellman.
Up until 1954, it was legal for public schools in the U.S. to be segregated by race. Black kids in one school, white kids in another. The landmark U.S. Supreme Court ruling Brown versus Board of Education declared that practice to be unconstitutional. But creating truly integrated U.S. schools has been a challenge. A new report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office finds that schools have become less integrated in recent years. From the school year starting in 2000 to the year ending in 2014, the number of highly segregated schools rose from 9% of U.S. schools to 16%. These schools are 75 to 100% African American or Hispanic and economically disadvantaged. This segregation contributes to an achievement gap between poor minority schools and better off predominantly white schools. Kimberly Quick studies education issues at the Century Foundation.
We know that highly segregated, economically and racially isolated schools are less likely to receive the same resources as schools that have more affluent children in them, right? So they're less likely to have advanced placement courses. They're less likely to have teachers that are considered highly qualified or experienced.
Recent trends are reversing decades of progress. Through the 1960s and 70s, courts forced public schools to integrate. Programs to bus minority students to more well-off white schools produced tangible results.
The 1980s, and particularly around 1980 itself, was a high point of integration. The achievement gap between black and white students was closing rapidly, and students were more likely to interact across class and race.
Since the 1980s, programs like busing have fallen out of favor, meaning students are often forced to attend neighborhood schools. Poor neighborhoods tend to have underperforming, underfunded schools. Many families who can afford to leave these neighborhoods for more expensive neighborhoods with better schools.
After we stopped busing and people had to return back to the neighborhoods, the only people who came back to those neighborhoods were predominantly poor and minority people. And so we moved from racial segregation to economic segregation.
The U.S. government estimates that by the year 2044, whites will no longer be in the majority in the United States. Integrating schools may be essential for students of all races to thrive. Janika and Erica are best friends. They say the benefits of integrated schools go well beyond just academics.
I don't even know who I would be today without desegregation.
I'd be a completely different person. I wouldn't be Janika. I wouldn't be me. I'd be someone different.
Reversing the trend won't be easy. There's little political appetite for policies like mandatory school busing and no clear path forward to make U.S. schools less segregated. Jim Spellman, CCTV, Washington.
Joining me now is Corinne Conover. She is a Washington, D.C. public school teacher and building representative for the Washington Teachers Union. From Mexico City, Patricia Gandara is the co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. In Philadelphia, Sean Harper is the executive director of the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education at the University of Pennsylvania. And from Phoenix, David Garcia is a professor of education at Arizona State University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sean, let me start with you. So here we have the United States, a country that prides itself in telling the rest of the world that this is the land of equality, not to speak of democracy, liberty, and opportunity. So how does one explain the fact that there are such high levels of segregation in the country's schools?
What we have to realize is that segregation is a byproduct of slavery and Jim Crow. You know, we are not even yet really 2 full generations removed from Jim Crow segregation. So I think that what we are seeing are long-standing and durable patterns of racial problems and racism in the country that plays itself out in who goes to school where.
And this is despite the fact, Sean, that we... So, Patricia, I'll get to you in a moment. I just want to get to Sean again. Despite the fact that you had that landmark decision almost 60 years ago when called Brown versus the Board of Education, which mandated integration in schools, or busing as it became known as well.
Sure. one thing to keep in mind historically with Brown was that there was a lot of resistance to the integration of black students and other students of color into white schools. And certainly whites were not enthusiastic at all about sending their children to schools that had formerly been all black. So, you know, it required the federal government to continue to press and to ultimately insist on desegregation with all deliberate speed. So I think that what we saw throughout the 70s and perhaps even into the early 80s was some compliance with federal mandates, but you know, we've seen consistent and persistent regression over the past couple decades in response to.
Right. Patricia, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that we actually made quite a bit of significant progress during those years after Brown, and that the South became, in fact, the most integrated area of schooling in the country. So what has happened is that we've had a whole series of court decisions by justices appointed by very conservative administrations that have set us back seriously away from the kinds of gains that we had made.
So when you say there have been setbacks, have these been violations of that Supreme Court ruling that mandated integration?
No, 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 no. The Supreme Court has narrowed and narrowed its decision so much that it's become virtually impossible for schools to actually create desegregated settings.
Right.
For example, the court came back and ruled against metropolitan desegregation. They no longer allow us to use race as a factor in desegregating schools.
David, of course, there's a growing Hispanic population in the United States. How are Latino schools particularly affected by segregation?
Yeah, I think we have a couple things going on, particularly here in Arizona, which is sort of the epicenter of a policy of policies that on their face do not look like they would impact segregation, but certainly do. And that's school choice. Here in Arizona, we have a situation where we have a rather extensive school choice policy. And actually that policy, which those types of policies are very popular across the United States, are contributing to the segregation that we're talking about today. A lot of the paradigms that we have to understand segregation come out of black and white dynamics in the South in the 60s. Currently, here, particularly in the West, we see Latinos and how they're choosing schools looking very different than both blacks and whites. And also we've got, well, I would argue that that's more multicultural in general, but we also have a phenomenon where because of school choice, we have students of many racial ethnic backgrounds choosing to go to school with other students like themselves in charter school settings.
Okay, let's bring in Corinne, who's with me here in the studio. Sean, I'll get to you in a moment. Corinne, you are a teacher. We're a teacher. You've been at the coalface, so to speak. What kind of impact does segregation have on schools with very high levels of African American and Hispanic students?
Well, I think it's important to remember when we talk about schools being divided, that it's not just a matter of race, it's really about socioeconomics. And what I see as being a teacher in the District of Columbia is that it really is about that most of our kids receive free and reduced lunch, which we know is that indicator for being high risk and poverty level, and that a lot of students don't have access to the things necessary to make them successful in school. And that goes, again, to not having access to the money and the things that go with that to make them successful. So I don't think it's just about race at this point, particularly in the District of Columbia. It's more so about socioeconomics.
But the contours of separation fall largely along racial lines?
And it ends up falling along racial lines. And that's the reality, that all of it is now completely integrated and intertwined what the problem is. So do we have schools where most of the poverty is reflected in a high black and Hispanic population? Absolutely, but that's just kind of the reality of America that we live in. In the school that I work in, most of our students are black. We might have maybe 1 or 2 Hispanics, and we have absolutely no whites. And most of our kids receive free or reduced lunch.
Now, do you find in schools like that that those schools in low-income areas with, students from low-income families, that they are under-resourced?
Definitely, definitely. When we have parents come in to talk to us, particularly on parent conference days, we find how many families don't have access to the internet, which is crucial at this point in being able to advance your students. How many parents don't even know where their local library is, and we have tons of libraries. We find out that some parents are actually functionally illiterate and don't have the means to be able to support their kids at home. So we find out that all the trappings that go with middle-class society and thinking are absent in these homes, and it makes it harder for us to do our job.
Okay, Sean, you wanted to say.
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in on the really good points that were made about school choice, and to just say that one thing that has remained consistent historically and contemporarily and all across the country, regardless of geographic region, is that when white families have the choice of where to send their children to school, they tend to choose to send their kids to schools with other white children, schools that have high concentrations of Black kids and Latino kids are seen as not as good, and whites are far less enthusiastic about sending their children there. You know, one thing that I find troubling about the segregated schooling conversation is that it tends to be terribly one-sided, in that the narrative is always about how schools that are predominantly Black and Hispanic are segregated. Well, the predominantly white schools are segregated as well. And I think that we have to also acknowledge that it's not just schools with Black and brown kids, but that also then means that white children are in schools that are largely segregated as well.